So the brain actually has some really distinct characteristics that separate it from a computer. The brain is actually a laboratory, and by our design and by our own will, it acts as a laboratory to take concepts, ideas, and models, and in a certain part of the brain it builds those concepts and ideas, and it says, I'll take a little bit from what I learned here, and a little bit from what I remember here, and a little bit of my experience here, and let me take those specific areas and ask the what-ifs, the possibilities, the potentials, contemplate on designs or ideals that are outside the boxes of what our present understanding is, to come up with a new understanding or an enlarged box. So the brain acts as a laboratory. It's an architect. It designs models and it puts the pieces together, and its main function is to come up with a new picture, a new concept. And by repeating it over and over again, there comes a moment when we become so involved in that concept, so involved in that idea, that we lose our attention or our awareness on our external environment, on the signals that are coming from our body to our brain, and on relative time, because all of our awareness has gone within. It's gone to that concept and idea. The moment that happens, that picture, that model, gets pushed or moves to the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is the area of the brain that is the executive. When an idea or a concept makes it to the frontal lobe without our mind wandering to a shopping list and the pain in our back and what time it is and who we have to call and our relationships, we've put all those aside, and we no longer keep re-accessing or re-interacting with parts of the brain that are already known within that box, but we're taking those individual concepts and models and ideas and building a bigger concept, and we lose track of our association to people, to places, to things, to times, to events, and we are completely focused on or concentrated on that idea. That's the moment that that idea makes it to the frontal lobe. And when that concept makes it to the frontal lobe, it becomes more real than the external environment. We lose track of the external environment. And that internal picture now that becomes more real than the external environment is literally where reality is happening, because all of our awareness is there. At that moment, another part of the brain becomes activated. That part of the brain is called the cerebellum. It is the oldest part of the brain. It has millions of connections per neuron as opposed to thousands of connections per neuron in the neocortexes. And that ability for that brain to become activated literally endorses or gives life to that model and causes the brain to become rewired and actually change reality, our perception of reality. The best way that a human being can become that observer is, first of all, having the awareness or the understanding intellectually that they don't always have to make the same choices over and over again. And secondly, be put in certain situations experimentally in your own personal life where you actually override those mechanisms in your body, and that takes practice. It's not something that we can do immediately because there is a tendency biologically for us to respond to preserve the body. The brain has certain centers in it that are only concerned with the preservation of the body. And the moment that we respond, those centers kick in, and it becomes almost breaking the habit of being human. We have to gain control and override those physiological functions that happen in our body. And the moment that we do that, each time we override those physiological responses, we're changing brain chemistry and actually breaking the addiction to that stimulus and response that so many people live by every day.
Is there a physical change that happens in the brain, or is it just in some nebulous mind state that this change happens?
Well, in order to explain the physiological chemistry in the brain, let's just back up here and give you just a little bit more on anatomy and brain function so that we can address the chemical changes that take place in the body. But remember, we talked about that tree that has all those branches that connect to other trees, and every place that it connects forms a thought or a memory. And that memory becomes wired in the brain. And if we get a series of experiences and information, we call that whole cluster of neurons a neural net. Well, every experience that we've had in our life that the brain builds on, it builds on a law of association. In other words, we learn about an apple by understanding first that it's red, and then we understand that it's round and it's smooth and it tastes a certain way, and it makes a certain noise when you bite into it. And so we develop a neural net that describes ourselves in terms of our interaction with an apple through our five senses. But if we start as a child, started to realize that not all apples are red, that they could actually be green, the moment we understand that all of a sudden causes the neural net to take more of a shape. And we actually build concepts based on this law of association. What we see, what we smell, what we taste, what we hear, what we feel. And by the second law, which is the law of repetition, which says that if we do something over and over and over again, by the mere fact that we're repeating it, the process of learning whatever we're learning starts to become simple. It starts to become automatic. It starts to become familiar. It starts to become easy. It starts to become natural. It starts to become subconscious. It almost starts to become unconscious. So the law of association and the law of repetition put together causes those nerve cells to literally become hardwired. As we repeat a process, whatever skill we're repeating, those connections in the brain start releasing certain chemicals called nerve growth factor. And that nerve growth factor acts almost like a miracle grow to cause a long-term relationship between one neuron and the next neuron. And that's what causes us to go from something that we have to put so much conscious awareness on and so much attention on to learn, to all of a sudden to be able to do something automatically and easily. It's because we literally wire it to the extent that holographically or dimensionally it starts interacting without our conscious mind. It becomes natural and becomes easy. So we have those same mechanisms structurally in our brain for certain attitudes or certain emotions that we live by on a daily basis. All the attitudes that we have had experiences with in our lifetime based on how we live. For example, the neocortexes in the brain, which are the where conscious awareness exists, is where all those connections take place. So everybody that we meet has their own series of intellectual experiences and experiences that they've had in their life, whether they were raised in a single family, or they were raised in with many children, whether they went to college, whether they studied art, whether they studied music, what their religious beliefs were, what their culture was, where they lived geographically. All of that forms that neural net in our brain. If they were loved and encouraged as a child, or if they were abused physically. And so all those experiences shape neurologically the very fabric of what's taking place in our perception or in our world. Those exact processes in terms of neural nets also exist in our brain. And when we respond to our environment, certain aspects of those particular neural nets are going to kick on or click on that are going to cause chemical changes in the brain that are ultimately going to cascade chemicals that run through our body. So, absolutely.
So you described the neural nets as basically these trees that basically wire themselves up together, which is a very mechanistic sort of point of view. You're wiring together little circuits. Whereas it's been suggested that the brain is actually holographic, which is not necessarily a hard wiring of the circuits. Which is, and how can it be both?
Great question, and scientists are debating that as we speak.
What are they debating?
Absolutely, the scientists are debating whether the brain is actually hardwired or if it has what we call neuroplasticity or elasticity. And the answer to the question right now is yes. We have parts of the brain that are hardwired by repetition. For example, the example I used of riding a bicycle. You don't have to think about riding a bicycle now. Neurologically, you have that wired, and all you have to do is access that part of your brain to be able to jump on the bicycle, and within moments, you'll be able to reformulate that mechanism, but that's hardwired. However, if I ask you to take certain concepts and ideas and follow a train of thought with me, those neurons literally that are available to still be imprinted upon are not static. They're not a tree that has branches. They're very elastic and they're very alive. And those very, very fine dendrites, we call them, or the fingers of those trees, can actually unhook and rehook to other nerve cells within seconds. How does that happen? It takes concentration, it takes focused attention, and it takes will to be able to cause those wiring mechanisms to take place. By the same means, it also takes concentration, will, and awareness to be able to stop those connections of hardwired habits that we have and we live by on a daily basis.
There is this debate in quantum mechanics about, we're affecting things on the micro level, not the macro level. And you've seen in some of the panels at the conference that there's a point beyond which they're not willing to go. And we can sit and discuss those things for a long time, and then we can go and do certain things that can negate what they think is possible. So what do we do with, on the one hand, the scientific model of what they're trying to develop, and then people having these experiences that are complete anomalies? What do we do with those two things?
Well, I think if we keep quantum physics and the understanding very simple for the layperson, that our observation has a direct effect on our world, I think if we keep it very simple, then people can get about the business of beginning to practice the skill of observation. See, the subatomic world responds to our observation, but the average person loses their attention span every 6 to 10 seconds per minute. So that doesn't leave a lot of room for our attention span. So how could the very large respond to someone who doesn't have the ability to even focus and concentrate? Maybe we're just poor observers. Maybe we haven't mastered the skill of observation, and maybe it is a skill. And maybe we're so addicted to the external world and so addicted to the stimulus and response to the external world that the brain is beginning to work out of response instead of out of creation. If we're given the proper knowledge and the proper understanding and given the proper instruction, we should begin to see measurable feedback in our life. If you make the effort to sit down and design a new life, and you make it the most important thing, and you spend time every day feeding it like a gardener feeds a seed, you will produce fruit. It may take some time in the beginning, and it may take some time in developing the art to control your mind from all the things that it needs to do. But most people stop because they look for the results in their world after a small amount of effort. And when they don't see those results, they immediately discount its possibility. And yet, right on the other side of that, right past that point where they stopped, is the potential still existing. We're lazy as human beings. We live in a convenience world, and if we don't get our quick, immediate fix on what we need, we're impatient. Quantum law responds to that as well. But we should be willing to sit down every day and take a piece of our day and set it aside and give thanks that we're alive, and give thanks that we have life, and give thanks for the life that we have. And then begin to observe by pure sincerity to design a new possible future for ourselves. And if we do it properly and we observe it properly, we should have opportunities begin to show up in our life, not equal to what we can predict, but outside of our prediction. It must be outside of our prediction, because when it is, we know that it's come from a greater mind. If it's equal to our prediction, then we're creating more of the same. How could we create a new world if we can predict the outcome? We're not creating anything new. And so, to look for feedback in our world, the brain loves feedback. It likes to know when it's succeeded or it's actually accomplished a task so that it'll do it again. And so, that sincerity and that level of mind gives people the opportunity then to apply first some principles of choosing a potential reality and observing it. And by doing it, they're willing to say, I know quantum physics works for the very tiny. I'm aware that it works for the very tiny as well. But when do you become a maverick and say, all of the greats that have ever lived has said it's always start with a thought or a dream, and why not get about the business of applying it to your own personal life? It's not that the quantum field doesn't respond, it's that we have to up our level of will and sincerity. And when that happens, we'll see measurable results in our life.
So, these so-called spiritual endeavors, is there a way to create measurable results?
There's, in our spiritual endeavors, and spirit is always kind of a connotation that people get stuck on, but in the application of our life, life is spiritual. Everything in life is spiritual, but in the application of it, there is absolutely a way in which we can begin to see measurable results in our life. It takes practice, and it's a skill.
One of the most popular things in the film, of course, is you talking about creating your day. And, you know, there's two single moments in the film that are the highlights, and that's one of them, and the other one is the water crystal exhibition. Where did you come up with the idea of creating your day?
Well, it's actually not my idea. There's a school in the Pacific Northwest of the United States called Ramtha School of Enlightenment, and all the students in that school create their day. All of the students in that school get serious about actually no longer becoming the victim of their day, but actually blessing the day and allowing it to unfold equal to their will. Now, everybody has their own measurable level of will. But if we practice our mental rehearsal and our skill in being able to do it will show that certain brain circuits will grow as a result of our effort. It'll get easier to do, in other words. If we accept that idea, then it will allow us to go back the next day and do it with more certainty and with more acceptance. That in itself is no different than praying. You see, there's no religious text that says thought doesn't matter. There's no religious text that doesn't say your prayer and your intention shouldn't be answered by God. But explaining how that happens is what quantum physics and the observer is all about. But still, when we can make thought more real than anything else, our brain is designed to do that. The frontal lobe, with its enormous space, is the altar in which we place a thought. And it gives us the permission to hold the thought for an extended period of time, and it lowers the volume to the external stimuli. We lose track of time and space. That's the moment we're stepping into the quantum field. That's the moment that now we're making thought more real than anything else. So when I create my day, my interpretation, what you saw in the movie is my interpretation of what I do. In other words, if I'm going to sit down and create my day, if I'm going to make the effort, then I am bold enough to ask for a response. I'm bold enough to say, I want it to come, and I want it to be a way that eliminates all of my doubt, and I want it to be just right outside the boundaries of what I can accept or what I can predict, and bring it in a way that usually will keep me in surprise or keep me in wonder, so that it inspires me to do it again and to learn more and to apply more knowledge to my next creation.
If you're the observer in that process, then who are you talking to?
Well, it's a great question. There's actually me, the observer. That's my personality, my free-willed self, given permission to do whatever I want in my life. Everybody has that free will. And then we have a constant aspect of ourself, the observer who's observing life in all of things. It is the force, the intelligence, the will that holds it all together. Now, every human being has that is alive. They're connected to it. And it is allowing and loving enough to give us life independent of our moods or choices or opinions. When that observer is observing life into me, and I emulate that same principle in observing my life, I am enacting the same action as the observer creating life. I am creating a life. And when we align with that principle, we are emulating our greatest potential, which is creation.
Do we live in a pre-established artifact of some kind? So I just want to bump that idea. Is there an artifact out there of objective reality? You know, because there's also this idea that we're creating reality.
Let's see how I want to answer this.
I'm just asking this because these are very common questions.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I
think that there's a very strong, unanimous social agreement amongst human beings because we experience the same things externally in our world, and our brain really maps a reflection of all the experiences that we can have in our world. So there is a unanimous agreement of the laws that govern 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions even. And we live by those laws, and our brain really has mapped all the possibilities and potentials over pretty much eons of experience. But there's still room for the brain to grow, and there's still room for us to evolve to greater virtues and to greater levels of mind. If that's the case, then it means then that we have to begin to break from the social agreements and the social consciousness that keeps everything intact and everything in order. That means then that we have to really gain knowledge that's outside of convention. Whether it's social convention or religious convention or scientific convention, we have to reach for information and knowledge that is beyond the boundaries of what's currently accepted. Now, to personalize that information and knowledge means we're going to apply it to actually try it out to have a new experience. Once we have that experience now, it begins to change the way in which our world should show up or present itself to us. But an experience isn't enough. We have to be able to reproduce that experience until it can become automatic. Once we do that, now we're beginning to master a new level of mind, and then we start to break from the agreements of 4 dimensions. We begin to defy the principles of this social agreement, and it is a collective consciousness, and the collective order allows the quantum field to respond to that, but by the same means, we have the ability to be able to process greater levels of mind, which then starts to separate us from this social agreement, and now we become individuals.